Well, hello and welcome to another episode of MMTed Q&A. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to all of those who keep submitting questions. We're trying to get to them as best we can. Now tonight, my special guest is Dr. Pavlina Tcherneva from Bard College in the United States, and she writes a lot about the job guarantee, and she has a new book out at the moment, and I recommend you get hold of it to explore the wonderful world of job guarantee. I pre-recorded a conversation with Pavlina. We explored three main issues, and finally we got on to discussing the role of the job guarantee in countries like Indonesia. So Pavlina, here's a question from Surya, and Surya lives in Indonesia, and him and his partner have been translating our macroeconomics textbook into Indonesian, and he's very active in promoting our ideas. He's very interested in job guarantee policy. His question is a job guarantee policy applicable to countries like Indonesia? And his general concern is that in these type of countries, they typically have an external deficit and they run fiscal deficits. And he's worried about whether with that combination of balances, whether you can run a job guarantee. And if you can, how do you do it in a less developing country? I think that's the general question.
Yes. So the viability of the job guarantee, I think, does depend on the ability of a nation to employ fully its sovereign spending powers. Of course, even countries that don't have that can and should attempt it, because as the government is always responsible for unemployment. It exists irrespective of whether you're in a monetary union or whether you're in a free-floating currency regime. And the cost of unemployment is still large. And so the kinds of calculus you might have to do would be a little different from a budgetary perspective, perhaps, if you have very strict, small fiscal space relative to a wider fiscal space, which of course is what we want to be able to sustain these policies, which are also anti-cyclical. And that's really what's very important. Indonesia is a very interesting case as far as I understand, because they have sovereign currency, but they have multiple self-imposed constraints on their budget, and they have kind of de facto accepted like the Maastricht criteria. They're trying to limit their deficit to GDP ratio to 3%. And recently they relaxed that rule, but only for 3 years, arguing that it has to be reinstated in 2023. And then their debt to GDP ratio is also artificially constrained, but it's very low. It is, I think, below 40% anyway. So by no criteria, IMF or otherwise, is this an unsustainable debt to GDP ratio. And of course, in a sovereign currency regime, there's no such thing as an unsustainable ratio in terms of in financial sense. Now, what is interesting for countries like Indonesia is that there are these various considerations that run against the consideration for full employment. So Indonesia is attempting to maintain its exchange rate, it's attempting to maintain certain balances, and at some point these will run against the goal of securing full employment. And I think in that sense, this is, I think that the policy priorities, need to be, rebalanced. Certainly Indonesia has the capacity to do it, and they can go ahead and do it. But if Indonesia is faced with mass unemployment from COVID, as we all are, then 3%, 6%, 10%, will have to run however large a deficit is necessary to address the economic fallout. So I think that would be the caveat that I think every country faces, that having your own currency doesn't necessarily provide full sovereignty. These artificial constraints have to fall off, because Indonesia's deficit is still going to breach the limit. Yeah. It's just going to be because of mass unemployment, not because of the job guarantee.
Yeah, but for some countries, I spoke to Fidel a couple of weeks ago, and these issues came up there too. And for some countries, they are in a bind, because if they're not resource rich, other than very fast-growing young populations. They rely on exports to bring in resources to allow them to have material prosperity. And so even though with their own currency they can make sure all the resources that they have available are fully employed, that still mightn't be a very prosperous outcome for them. And in that context, I think in the world situation, that's what we thought the IMF was going to be, or the World Bank. And so for some countries, we're going to have to revise our multilateral institutions so that they can support countries that are resource poor, but have young growing populations that need jobs.
Yeah, I think that it's about provisioning, and so for me always the comparison is what are we faced with now. So even if you have all of these various constraints in terms of your exchange rate, whether in terms of policy, limits on debts and deficits, what would the current economic situation look like? What will those conditions present to us? And when we have COVID, financial crisis, irrespective of these limits, governments have to respond to those calamities. And what we tend to do, trapped in the neoliberal regime, is of course endure destitution and unemployment in the name of stable exchange rate.
Yeah.
There is little economic reason to do this. And so we're paying for unemployment one way or another. The point of MMT is to articulate that these are unnecessary costs and artificial limits.
Yeah, Randy Ray and I did some work in Pakistan some years ago, and they're a similar sort of situation. And we were asked by the officials, well, what would the job guarantee do? We argued that one of the things that the government could stimulate would be jobs in import competing areas that would reduce the pressure on the external balance. And the other thing I note recently is that Pakistan's currently got very high unemployment as a result of the health issues, but they've launched a massive tree planting scheme, which is saving a lot of local communities and also underpinning the future environmental care. So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that some of these very large-scale employment programs that have been tried in recent history were tried in developing countries. We've had the New Deal experience in the US and other countries, but in more recent history, of course, Argentina employed 13% of the labor force in the depths of a big crisis, and they had no trouble creating jobs. But also India is an interesting case, which has the only legally enforceable right to rural employment, not urban, rural. And so it's very interesting to see some of the research that comes out of India, that it has created assets for rural communities. It has improved materially the quality of life, whether it is water, infrastructure, whether it is greening projects as well. And now in the midst of COVID, when so many people from urban areas are fleeing and going back to their rural homes, that has been the only thing that has provided them with livelihood and income, and has actually increased the net job creation in the rural area relative to pre-COVID. So it just shows how important it is to have it as a permanent infrastructure to respond to any crisis.
And the work that I've done in South Africa on the expanded public works program, that's now created guaranteed work for millions of people. The evaluation we did started to see the impacts upon the children of the people, because the parents had income in the townships for the first time, and then they could buy books and risk manage their own families better. And the children were able to perform better at school for the first time. And so, dramatic improvements.
That's right. And I think that's quite right, Bill. If we were incorporating all of these costs into our macroeconomic modeling, I think that we'll probably find out that unemployment is paid several times over. And it was the same experience that we had when we went to Argentina and when we talked to poor women that took up work in the HEFES projects, how they reported even the smallest things that they learned and they did materially improve their lives, whether it is just being recognized, by their family members as contributing members, whether it's being recognized in the community. But what was also interesting is that when the program was being phased out and reformed again, under neoliberal pretense that, women are unemployable, they were artificially brought into the labor market, let's just send them home and take care of their children. The World Bank ran a pilot, and women will not transition to the basic income program that was put in place so long as the Plan Jefes projects were still running. So they'll still show up for work. So there are many ways in which we could see the impact that it makes on poor communities, poor families, and just the overall well-being.
Okay, Surya, I hope that answers your question. Thanks, Pavlina, for joining us and giving us your time. And congratulations on your new book. It's a wonderful book and a great contribution to the literature on job guarantee. And I hope it does really well. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's good to be with you.
Okay, that's it for tonight. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back next week with more questions and hopefully some more interesting answers. In closing, I just want to thank all of those who have made donations to MMTed so far. We really appreciate that and thank you. MMTed relies on public donations to build our capacity and to get us in a position where we can offer courses free of charge to the general public. We hope to start floating courses in September of this year. So if you can help, we really appreciate it. Thank you. Until next week, see you later.